History as it happens, July 7, 2022. Patterns.
We must embark on a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas.
A new world order can emerge, a new era.
The survival of liberty in our land increasingly depends on the success of liberty in other lands.
But their fight is part of a larger fight that unites all people. There's a fight that so many of the patriots whose eternal rest is here in these hallowed grounds were part of. The battle between democracy and autocracy.
Since the end of the Second World War and the dawn of the American century, U.S. leaders have spoken of a historic mission, an inescapable responsibility to spread democracy, capitalism, the American way of life to others. This crusade has led to disaster after disaster, a pattern repeating in one failed intervention after another. What drives the pattern? Or maybe the better question is, why do some people think they know what's best for others? That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We will only succeed in this interconnected world by continuing to lead the fight for free people and free and fair trade. A free and prosperous global economy is essential for America's prosperity.
We are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes.
It's not just a matter of the United States or Great Britain or France. One of the things that's implicit in the essay is that maybe this idea of exclusive knowledge is something that every culture has, which is a kind of a responsibility on its shoulders, which it must share with the rest of the world.
It is said that history does not repeat, but it rhymes. You know, the same might be said of U.S. foreign policy since the start of the Cold War. I had never listened to Harry Truman's inaugural address in 1949, delivered at the dawn of what we now call the Cold War, until a couple of days ago. I was led there by a book chapter written by our guest on this episode, my friend and Ithaca College political theorist Naeem Inayatullah. He cited Truman's speech and the work of historian Nick Cullather to back up the following argument. Here it is. Someone or some country, in this case the USA, feels compelled to help other countries because Americans possess exclusive knowledge about how best to organize society, politics, the economy, whatever. And with that knowledge comes a responsibility to, in the case of the early years of the Cold War, share that knowledge with others to keep them out of the grip of international communism. Here is President Harry Truman, 1949.
The United States is preeminent among the nations in the development of industrial and scientific techniques. The material resources which we can afford to use for assistance of other peoples are limited, but our imponderable resources in technical knowledge are constantly growing and are inexhaustible. I believe that we should make available to peace-loving peoples the benefits of our store of technical knowledge in order to help them realize their aspirations for a better life. Democracy alone can supply the vitalizing force to stir the peoples of the world into triumphant action, not only against their human oppressors, but also against their ancient enemies, hunger, misery, and despair.
Democracy alone, he said. You know, that speech was in many ways a first for an American leader, and every president since has echoed Truman, whether it's in the fight against communism, terrorism, or now autocracy. We are here to help. So why do some people think they know what's good for others? Is the title of the chapter Naeem Inayatullah wrote for the book Global Politics. And it is the question we're going to deal with here as we try to build off conversations in my recent episodes about why the U.S. continues to donate its knowledge to uphold democracy and capitalism elsewhere. And that is important because our defense budget is now something like $800 billion a year, even though we're not fighting any direct wars. Congress has okayed about $50 billion for Ukraine this year alone, for what may prove to be a losing cause, because Russia will always enjoy military preeminence over its neighbor. Now, you might be saying, hold on, Martin, you're getting lost in abstractions. Or maybe I'm just paying too much attention to the rhetoric. All that lofty talk of freedom and democracy, it's really a screen for more materialist or realist concerns. Well, I don't know. Go back and listen to presidential speeches that were designed to prepare the American people for a war or the Marshall Plan, for instance, some mission of global importance. It's almost always framed as an inescapable duty for a nation that finds itself once again at a make-or-break moment whose outcome will determine history, the fate of our way of life. In 1990, President George H.W. Bush didn't say Iraq's invasion of Kuwait was just a tiny war we can ignore. He said Iraq was jeopardizing the security of the entire world, a new world order that the U.S. had to lead into the 21st century.
This is the first assault on the new world that we seek, the first test of our mettle. Had we not responded to this first provocation with clarity of purpose, if we do not continue to demonstrate our determination, it would be a signal to actual and potential despots around the world.
And then in 2005, his son, after winning re-election, declared that the U.S. could only remain free by donating democracy on a global scale.
The best hope for peace in our world is the expansion of freedom in all the world.
Even when questions have been raised about, say, the 2003 invasion of Iraq, rarely did U.S. politicians question the fundamentals. Here's Republican Senator Chuck Hagel in late 2002 in the debate over the use of force authorization President Bush wanted for the war that would start a few months later. Hagel doesn't doubt the U.S. has this exclusive knowledge about what's best for human emancipation. He only questioned the manner in which the Bush administration was choosing to donate our gifts to the Iraqis.
I approach the issue of post-Saddam Iraq and the future of democracy and stability in the Middle East with more caution, realism, and a bit more humility. While the people of the Arab world need no education from America about Saddam's record of deceit, aggression, and brutality, and while many of them may respect and desire the freedoms that the American model offers, imposing democracy through force in Iraq is a roll of the dice.
Hagel took a lot of heat for that speech, although he wound up voting for the use of force authorization. Now, Ukraine, that is a different case. That nation wants our help. Its leaders want our weapons and money to fight the Russian invaders. But you can hear echoes of Truman's early Cold War speeches in President Biden's exhortations in a global war against autocracy.
Between liberty and repression, between appetites and ambition of a few, will forever seek to dominate the lives and liberties of many.
The pattern repeats. But why? Can looking at international relations as a donor-receiver relationship help us answer that question? Naeem Inayatullah, welcome, my friend.
Thank you.
It's great to see you.
It's a pleasure.
So I'm going to let the audience know. Full disclosure, I was in your very first class at Ithaca College way back in the mid-1990s. I'm in my mid-40s. You were in your mid-40s then.
I do remember it.
And now look at this. The tables are turned. I'll be interrogating you on the podcast.
Your secret wish and dream.
That's right. Well, we're going to get to your recent book, your latest book, your memoir about your teaching method, about how, well, you refused to answer a lot of my questions in class. There was a logic to that. We're going to get to that in a little bit. It actually ties in with this conversation we're going to have about patterns and empires, and an essay you wrote in the journal Global Politics that had the title, Why Do Some People Think They Know What Is Good for Others? I feel like we've been having this conversation, though, ever since I graduated from your class. I don't even know what I got in your class. Maybe a B+. I should have gotten an A+. Ever since I departed your class many years ago. Tell me a little bit about your essay. Why did you want to write this essay?
It's actually not from a journal. It's from a book by two scholars, Maya Zafis and Jenny Atkins. The title was given to me. It's an IR textbook, international relations textbook, and it's a set of questions. Each chapter is a question. And the question that they gave to me was this one: why do some people think they know what's best for others? And the mandate was to write this essay in a style that undergraduates could read it.
Because that's an interesting way of looking at this issue of how the United States, not just the United States, the British Empire, the French Empire, nation states find themselves interfering in other countries. You talk about this donor-receiver dynamic that the U.S. has, or American leaders have felt they have this exclusive knowledge that our country needs to impart on other peoples.
It's not just a matter of the United States or Great Britain or France. One of the things that's implicit in the essay is that maybe this idea of exclusive knowledge is something that every culture has, which is a kind of a responsibility on its shoulders, which it must share with the rest of the world.
And you also relate that to interpersonal relations.
Yeah.
Parents
absolutely.
and children.
Exactly. Friends, often friends with each other believe this to be the case. Brothers and sisters, parents and children. Yes, absolutely.
Teachers and students.
By definition, almost in the institution, the higher education institution, but also K through 12, the premise is that the teacher knows what's best for the students.
And you resist that imposition. That's part of your teaching method.
Yes, I think it's important to question that claim. I don't reject it altogether, but I do think that there's something that goes awry if you just accept that, which we do. Yeah, in the classroom, K through 12, and also in college, almost every professor I know accepts the premise that they know what's best for their students. And almost every student I know accepts that premise as well. That's the kind of the silent agreement that a professor and a student have by being in the classroom.
And on the global stage, that premise is democracy is good, therefore everyone wants it. No one would think to say no when you come offering this.
Yes, but democracy is only the latest, right? Democracy is what the United States feels like it has to offer the rest of the world. Its exclusive knowledge, its gift to the world. Prior to that, for example, in the Spanish and the Portuguese Empire, it was Christianity is what the Europeans have to offer the rest of the world. Yeah. So these things change. Each culture, each empire believes itself to have some kind of unique stance, some unique piece of knowledge, and then it feels the responsibility to share that with the rest of the world. Yeah. Share is not the right word. The person who has that sense of exclusivity feels that it's sharing, but from the point of view of others, it probably doesn't feel as much like sharing.
Especially if bombs are falling.
Yes. When we get to the issue of how do we get others to accept our gifts, and that one of the ways that we do that is through violence, then it becomes complicated.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of layers to this. One of them is this donor-receiver dynamic that you explain as one factor or one mechanism of it. But you're clever in the way you wrote this 24-page article or chapter in a book. You don't start off right away with U.S. foreign policy. You go back to Francisco de Vitoria, his outrage about the way the Catholic Church was treating the indigenous peoples of, I guess, Central America, South America.
Yes.
Yeah. And in that case, it was Christianity. But he did not deny the Indians' humanity. It was actually because he saw them as human, or because the Spanish believed they were humans with potential, that made them then vulnerable to, having to take what the Spanish, you're good enough for our religion, take it.
Yes. If the Spaniards would have believed fully, some of them did, that the Indians were slaves or less than human beings, then they wouldn't have worried about the kinds of things that Victoria worried about, which is what are Spanish responsibilities to the Amerindians. But since many of the Spaniards did believe that these were actual real human beings and part of the human family, they then came to the next question. What is the Spanish responsibility towards the Amerindians?
So what did de Vitoria conclude? You consider him, or I should say in your chapter, the words appear, he is considered a canonical figure in international law.
Yeah. He concluded two things. I don't have the details in front of me, but the broad scope of it is that on the one hand, he rejected the claim that these people were less than human beings, and therefore rejected the claim that they could become slaves and that we could do with them as we wanted. But he couldn't get over the fact that there were a number of things that the Amerindians supposedly did that seemed to go against biblical teachings, for example, or natural law teachings. He believed that, for example, that they were cannibals. He believed, for example, that they believed in multiple gods. And he believed that they were much lower in their civilizational capacity. So all these factors made him wonder, okay, yes, they're human beings, but what exactly is our relationship to them? They're certainly lower on the developmental scale They're not fully human beings yet, but they can be taught. So the idea was that, yes, they're human beings just like us, but they somehow lost the trail of civilizational advance, and that therefore now the Spaniards had a responsibility to civilize them, to educate them.
So they find an opening to violate the Amerindians' rights to self-determination.
Yeah, there you go. But they don't see it that way. The Spaniards didn't see it as a violation of the sovereign self-determination of the Amerindians. They thought of it as, okay, how do we discharge God's responsibility? God has given us Christianity. We understand this exclusive knowledge to be a gift. Is it not our responsibility now to, in their language, share this gift with the rest of the world, with the Amerindians who've been left behind by civilization?
And in order to believe that you have or know what's best for others, you have to convince yourself, maybe not convince yourself, maybe that's not the right way of putting it, but you have to think that you actually understand the other.
Yeah.
That you understand all aspects of their culture when you probably don't. I often think in this context, we'll bounce around a little bit here, LBJ in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson didn't know a damn thing about Vietnam. But Americans knew that South Vietnam needed to not be communist. But let's stay with D. Vittoria for a bit. I mean, he thought he knew what the Indians, what they were all about.
Yeah. I think this is a very important point that you raised. It doesn't really come out in my essay. Yes, I think you do have to believe that not only do you have this exclusive knowledge, but you also understand the other, therefore you know what the other needs. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And that's also reaches far back into history.
And it's not that you don't have something to offer other people. It's the way you go about it, right? That causes resentment for the receiver.
Yes, that's exactly it. It's the analogy that I make in the chapter is that when you're a child, your parents probably do know better than you do what is best for you. But that doesn't stop you from feeling resentment. That doesn't stop you from feeling that you were violated somehow of making your own decisions. All that is true. As a child, you have the right to be resentful for these decisions being made for you. You feel that.
I know that this may sound like an abstract conversation, but we're going to apply it to real-world situations. Well, you're a political theorist. You kind of live in the abstract.
Indeed. Well, yes. You know, I eat and need exercise and sleep, so I live in the concrete world. But yes, most of my time is occupied by abstractions. It's true.
That's right. You don't read, I shouldn't say you don't read newspapers, but, you know, you're not up on current events like some people are.
Yeah, I'm making my business not to be wrapped up in current events. And I don't know if you remember this from your time at IC, but I encourage my students not to follow current events because college is one of the few times in your life that you get to explore the abstract, or as you would say, that you get to explore the patterns of history. So it's not a matter of saying don't pay attention to current events altogether. It's a matter of saying, look, those current events are the result of historic patterns. And it's these 4 years that you have are a chance to actually examine those patterns as opposed to just the current events.
Patterns. I've been obsessed with trying to understand patterns. Not that they are deterministic, right? History doesn't operate in a straight line, but there's a reason they're patterns.
Yes.
Pope Innocent IV, you discuss him as well. His name, I did not know this before he became the Pope, Sinibaldo Fieschi, before he became Pope Innocent IV, way back in 1243 to 1254. So there's an amazing exchange that Pope Innocent has that you describe, where he needs to make contact with, I guess it was the Mongols.
Yes, the Mongols.
Yeah, and that was Genghis Khan's grandson, I think. He wrote a letter to him.
Yeah, Goya Khan, yes.
Yeah, he writes a letter to the Mongols saying, you know, I need your help for, he was in some political bind and he needed help. But the letter says, and we will make sure you see the light of Christianity and we will pleasantly convert all of your people. The Khan writes back a letter that says the same thing. No, actually, you Christians need to come to our side of all this. It was interesting. Yes. Both sides thinking they had exclusive knowledge the other needed.
Come and bow to us. The Pope is offering for the Mongol king to come and bow to him. And the Mongol king says, are you joking? We've conquered most of the world. Clearly, God is with us. You must come and bow to us.
So then you make the leap to contemporary history. You talk about how after 9/11, the United States felt it had a duty to share equal rights with Afghan women.
Yeah, so I don't want to undervalue the vengeance quality of U.S. motivations after 9/11. Those were definitely there. I was in this country at that point, of course, and I could feel that sense of vengeance. And yet, no empire, no country, no leadership is going to say, listen, this is all about vengeance. They're not even going to say this is all about control of territory or control of resources. This is not how leadership imagines itself. This is not how empires and countries imagine themselves. They want to be able to say that this strike, this bombing, this occupation is for a good cause, for an idealist cause. And the one that they selected, of course, at that point was women's rights, Afghan women's rights. And so there was an offensive on the part, a media offensive on the part of the Bush administration to make sure that this was seen, that the reason that the United States was going to bomb and invade Afghanistan was because they were concerned for the rights of Afghan women.
In addition to wanting to punish the people who perpetrated 9/11, there are these other more humanitarian imperatives as well.
Exactly.
And as you said, no empire, no nation feels like what they're doing is wrong, right? I mean,
yes.
In other words, when we hear the speeches and the rhetoric and all that soaring, the soaring rhetoric about freedom and democracy, we should take them at their word. They actually do believe it.
Yes, this is a controversial claim, which I endorse almost fully. And there are other historians who also endorse this claim. The easy diagnosis is to think that there's
cynicism,
the rhetoric of idealism backed by where the real intentions are material, occupational, realist. Yeah. But actually, I think that undervalues the danger of empire. Yeah, the real danger is not necessarily just in the materialist motives or the self-interested motives, because if you have only materialist motives, then you stop your empire after you've gained the materiality, or after you've gained the occupation, after you've gained the territory. An idealist empire, on the other hand, never ends. It's forever, because you're trying to. How long would it take to do good things for Afghan women? Well, that would take a very, very long time, potentially, hundreds of years maybe, yeah? Or how long would it take for Christianity to be something that the Amerindians accepted? Well, that could take hundreds of years. Or how long might the British say that the subcontinent or the Indonesians or the Pacific Islanders needed civilization? Well, that would take hundreds of years. So when you have an idealist claim, you're bound to the long term, whereas a more materialist claim to somebody else's resources or territories could end in a couple of decades.
And on the issue of Afghan women, we misread that. Who am I referring to? The United States, the Bush administration, humanitarian organizations, mainstream liberals, they couldn't quite understand why Afghan society wasn't willing to take what they were offering them because of deeply ingrained historical, cultural ideas in Afghanistan.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, we went too fast.
Exactly. There's an irony here, because the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan had partially the same motivations. The Soviets believed that they were trying to help Afghan women as well. There are many reasons for this actual Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, but one of them was that the local communist parties were moving too fast into the countryside, trying to liberate girls and women. And so the Soviets actually sent a message to the Communist Party of Afghanistan that said, listen, you're going too fast, you need to slow down. And if you don't slow down, we're going to have to make sure that you do slow down by occupying Afghanistan. So the ironic twist for me is that both the Soviet Union and the United States use the pretense of civilizing Afghanistan through liberating its women as a reason for the occupation. But it's not just a pretense. I think both the Soviets and U.S. leadership actually believed they were trying to do good for these women.
The French saw their colonies or their colonial empire as a civilizing mission.
Yeah.
Some historians have made the argument that the colonies actually were a net loss for the European powers.
Yes.
They didn't
I've heard that argument. It's a good one. So it goes something like this.
Because of the costs of maintaining. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's take the British, for example. Before the British occupation of India, that it cost the British Empire much more than what they got out of it. Yeah. Okay, let's suppose that to be true, although that I think is an empirical question. Let's suppose that to be true. That still doesn't follow from that lots and lots of Britishers didn't make millions of pounds, didn't make tremendous amounts of wealth from the colonization of India. So the British government might have in the net lost something, but it's still the case that all kinds of Britishers became incredibly wealthy as a result of colonialism, yes? So we have to think about the net effect, not only in terms of what the British Exchequer gets out of it, but also what the Britishers as a whole get out of it.
That's interesting. We can take the antebellum South in the United States. Slavery created a lot of wealth for some people, but it left that region of this country an economic shambles, a backwater.
Yes.
Not to digress about that. Let's stay. This is sometimes.
It's actually not a digression, but we can come back to it if you like, because I think one of the causes of the Civil War is that the North could see that the South of the United States would end up being colonized, economically colonized by the British. And they didn't want to see that happen. So we can come back to that if you like.
Naeem Inayatullah expounding upon American history, U.S. history. Have you ever read a book about the American Civil War?
The thing is that the books that I have read are always global in their context. So the kinds of historical tomes that I enjoy the most are the ones that take every event in a particular country, say the Civil War in the United States, and place it in the context of what's going on in the global political economy.
So I mentioned you made this leap from discussing the Spanish and Pope Innocent in the 1200s to the rights of Afghan women. But I actually jumped over something in your article, in your chapter. Harry Truman, his inaugural address, most of Truman's speeches in the late 1940s when the post-World War II order was coming into focus, deal with this issue. And that is, we move from a Christian mindset to a secular concept of exclusive knowledge. I think you're right about taking people at their word. For decades afterwards, generations of American leaders all sound like Truman.
Yeah.
Right?
The differences between communism and democracy do not concern the United States alone. People everywhere are coming to realize that what is involved is the material well-being, human dignity, and the right to believe in and worship God.
Yeah, Truman. Yeah, so the United States actually understood the appeals of socialism / communism. You can take I don't know what kind of language you want to use here, whether you want to call it socialism or communism. I'm going to call it socialism. The ideological fount of capitalism comes from Europe, Great Britain, France, but also eventually ends up the ideological power of capitalism is being pushed by the United States. And so we get the Cold War after the Russian Revolution, of course, and the formation of the Soviet Union. It's not as if the United States didn't understand the appeals of socialism. The United States domestically understood the appeals of socialism and communism. And we can see this in all kinds of literature, novels written by, for example, Upton Sinclair. Yeah? So it's precisely because the United States understood the appeals of socialism and the appeals of communism and the sort of the negativity of the fallout of capitalism that it began to become what I would call anxious. It became to become anxious about the competition between the capitalist enterprise system and socialism and communism on the other hand. And it is from that anxiety, it's from understanding the appeals of socialism and the negatives of capitalism that it can understand why some people might be, especially third world people, but third world people within the borders of the United States also, they might be intrigued by socialist and communist principles. And so what Truman is, in a sense, saying to the world is, look, I'm reading this between the lines, subconsciously from his speeches. Look, our system is better. We understand that you might be pushed to like socialism and communism, and you might want to align yourself with the Soviet Union. But we're here to tell you that our system is better, and we're here to actually show you with material benefits how much better our system is. Yeah.
That regime adheres to a false philosophy which purports to offer freedom security, and greater opportunity to mankind. Misled by that philosophy, many peoples have sacrificed their liberties, only to learn to their sorrow that deceit and mockery, poverty and tyranny are their reward.
So the Cold War actually ends up being a war about U.S. anxieties about the benefits of socialism and the costs of capitalism.
Well, the post-colonial revolts were nationalist movements, but they were embracing socialist ideas. I mean, everywhere.
Indeed. Yeah, indeed.
In Africa, Asia.
Yeah.
Well,
That's
China,
correct.
the largest country in the world, population-wise, right? 1949, communist.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Here's the key point, I think, that helps tie this all together. You just alluded to it. Part of this anxiety, part of this feeling that you have to share your knowledge with others, it reveals an insecurity, the sense that the giver, he senses, the nation senses its own lack.
Yes. Yeah. We can actually develop an empathy for the empire and the leadership of the empire, because it's not that they're evil. It's not even that their sense of social responsibility is paramount. It's that inside that sense of responsibility is doubt about their own power, about their own convictions. So as usual, as we discussed when you were my student back in the day, 1996, I think it was, at the heart of any conviction is doubt. And what kind of relationship you have with that doubt reveals almost everything that we need to know about somebody or some leadership or some culture.
So you might then feel the need to achieve self-fulfillment by making others see the greatness of your ideas.
Exactly.
I mean, we're seeing that in Ukraine now, in a sense. Sorry to interrupt, Naeem.
No, keep going.
You know, there are what you referred to earlier as realist considerations here, right?
Yes.
The United States has had a relationship with Ukraine since the 1990s, right after the Soviet Union collapsed. Never made it into NATO, but still. There's oil, there's wheat, there's all these other things. But you hear it in the rhetoric of Joe Biden, and I think we should take him at his word. This is about restoring American leadership, helping democracy survive. Francis Fukuyama basically says the fate of global democracy lives or dies based on what's happening in the fields of eastern Ukraine.
Yes.
I might be overstating his argument a little bit, but not by much. I mean, he's written about this. He was on my podcast talking about the importance of Ukraine for post-1989 democracy.
So is there a question there, Martin?
No. That was a De Caro pontification segment. I brought up Fukuyama. I mean, I think this relates to our conversation. He had a concept of where history was going. You don't buy the end of history. His seminal argument made in '89 that he has, amended and added to since. He's written other books since then.
No, I think that if we're going to talk about human freedom as a whole for everybody on the planet, the democratic process definitely has allowed us to see what is required as a part of freedom. But that's not the only thing that's required in human emancipation, in freedom. Because what's missing and has been missing since the Cold War is the economic element in human freedom, human emancipation. And for Fukuyama to say that we have arrived at the end of history, which I take to mean that he's saying, we have discovered all the institutions that are necessary for human freedom to exist, and now all we have to do them is apply them all over the world. That, in a nutshell, I take to be his argument. I think that is incorrect, or rather insufficient. We might have discovered what is necessary for human participation in freedom politically, but we have yet to discover, or rather what the Cold War was all about was, have we discovered the economic components of human emancipation? There were two answers to that given after the Cold War. And I think that what Fukuyama is actually suggesting at this point is that we can easily ignore the economic components of human emancipation.
Fukuyama's idea is seductive, right? Not the end of history as a terminus, end as in means to an end, right? And history as development. He's explained this himself.
Yeah.
He didn't mean that 1990 was the last year of human civilization.
Of course not.
Yes, the whole point of the development, and that's Hegelian, right? The development of history The development of nations, which Hegel referred to as history, was to find the best way to organize a society.
Yes, yes.
Well, maybe so. And this is, again, another key point. I hope we can tie all this together. When the recipients of our generosity don't want what we're offering, and then it devolves into violence, that can last a long time. Wars can go on a long time. And then ultimately, failure, you declare victory and go home. But then the pattern repeats.
Yes.
This is something I've always discussed with you, and I don't think I have a good answer for why that happens.
Yes.
You once said to me, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, shall we count the repetitions?
Yeah, I think this is, in my research, this is the biggest of the questions. One, is repetition happening? And I think we would agree that yes, repetition is happening. Why is repetition happening and what can we do about it? Okay, so what can we do about it is a function of the diagnosis. So the real question becomes, why is the repetition happening? And I think I want to say two things about that. This is sort of what I would call a psychodynamic approach. Yeah, one is that repetition is happening because subconsciously the entity that's repeating the actions wants to experience what prior generations experienced. Yeah. Now, this happens very much in the relationship between parents and children. Children repeat the patterns of their parents in order to experience what their parents had gone through. Okay. So that's one of the motives of repetition. The second element of repetition is the one that's more hopeful, which is that the reason you want to experience the repetition is that after you have experienced it, you can actually transcend the repetition. Yeah. That doesn't often happen. Now, here's the question. Why doesn't that often happen? What we get is a cycle, a repetition of new empire or a new set of new leadership makes the same mistakes, yeah, as the old one. The British did this, the French did this, the US is in the middle of doing all this. Each generation is experiencing what the previous generation experienced. And like I said, part of that is merely to have a relationship with the previous generation. But ultimately, this project of repetition has the logic where the repetition can amount to saying, okay, now that I've experienced what my grandparents experienced, or my parents experienced, or the previous generations have experienced, how can I now overcome their limitations and not repeat this pattern? Yeah, that's the big hope. Yeah.
Yes.
So this is the two-step dynamic that I think is involved in historical repetitions.
So Vietnam creates the Vietnam Syndrome.
Indeed.
Which was not a good thing in the eyes of American interventionists. So we had to find a way to kick that Vietnam Syndrome. Yeah, so Reagan found Grenada. That wasn't enough to do it. In 1991...
Well, small steps, right?
Yeah. Transcend the pattern, to use your words, in 1991 when the United States seemed to convince itself that it had mastered war. An easy, clean victory over Saddam Hussein's Iraq after invaded Kuwait.
Yeah. Yeah, there it is. Yeah. So the trick is that the new generation thinks, okay, we're not going to make the same mistakes as the previous one because we have new technology, or we have new tactics, or we have a new frame of mind. But actually, they're making the same mistakes. Yeah. So the question for the historian, I think, becomes, for the psychodynamic historian, becomes, one, why does the new generation think that it's actually not making the same mistakes as the old one? And how do we get to the point where, in fact, that becomes true, that the new generation can go through the experience of the repetition and then say to itself, okay, we're done. We don't have to do this anymore.
What if historians are apologists for empire?
It's not just historians who are apologists for empires. I make the claim often, and even at conferences, that the whole purpose of academia is to offer an apology for empire. Academics, almost 90% of our job is to excuse and offer reasons for why empire is a good thing.
Not Naeem Inayatullah, though.
Well, it doesn't matter what I do as a particular person, because I'm ensconced in an institution whose purpose it is to excuse and explain empire.
There's a structure.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah. That's an inside joke, I guess, for listeners. We've talked about structures a long time, even though I'm not sure I quite understand them.
Well, the structure is just the repetitions, right? There's a pattern of repetitions, and we can call that an institution, or we can call that a structure. Structure is just the logic of the game that's being played out.
So if there were an opportunity for the United States to reconsider what it believed its role had to be in the world, maybe it was in 1991 when the Cold War ends and the Soviet Union is gone. But no, right? This confirms that we were right all along, and now let's extend it even further. I think everyone should seek out, I'm guessing you probably haven't listened to this speech, but maybe you have, or maybe you've read it. December 25th, 1991, President George H.W. Bush delivers a televised address. It's Christmas Day. The Soviet Union is gone. Gorbachev has stepped down. The red flag has come down off the Kremlin. He addresses the American people and declares victory.
This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
The only thing that can prove that a culture's values were the right ones is if the rest of the world voluntarily embraces them. Yeah, that's the only thing. So it's always too early for any leader to declare our values are victorious, because the actual evidence would be the rest of the world comes to you and says, hey, this is really admirable what you've accomplished. How can we do the same?
Someone might say, well, look at post-war Europe. The CIA, though, right? Whenever communists were going to make gains in, say, the Italian elections, we just tend to think that Western Europe, Central Europe embraced American democracy after World War II. And there is some truth to that.
Yeah.
But in the United States also, we manipulated that situation.
There's a lot of evidence to back that up when we look at the archives of the CIA and involvement with elections and all kinds of covert activities. But it's also the case that the Eastern European people, not having experienced full capitalism, wanted to experience that full capitalism.
Right. They didn't want to live under Soviet domination any longer.
Indeed. They had been given the gift of Soviet communism, and they had rejected that gift, as the pattern would suggest that would happen. Now we have to give them time to do the same for full-on capitalism. If the Eastern Europeans have now embraced full-on capitalism, it's going to take, I think, a couple of generations for them to recognize that this is also not what they wanted.
Well, it's funny. There's a story about late Cold War, the Eastern Bloc. There are revolutions brewing in these Eastern Bloc countries. Many of them are socialists, right? They just don't like Soviet communism. They want to create their own form of socialism. And socialist radicals from Western Europe are visiting Eastern Europe, telling them, hey, what are you guys doing? Then the Eastern Europeans say, do you have any idea what you're talking about? Get out of here. You don't know what it's like living under this. So is U.S. hegemony ending? I had Alfred McCoy, great historian, on recently, and he said it's over. China will soon be if not the global hegemon, a regional hegemon, and the United States will no longer be a global hegemon, but will also be a regional hegemon. I remember I raised this with you recently, and you said, it's hard to say because empires can hang on for a long time.
Yeah, empires can hang on for a long time, but there's another element of this that I might want to share with you, Martin, and that is capitalism hangs on for a long time. Yeah. So some people have made the claim that the Chinese are already either have a bigger economy or will have a larger economy, and therefore that capitalism is slipping out of the hands of the United States to control, and therefore U.S. hegemony is over. And I'm thinking, no, wait a minute. No. The real fuel of capitalism is not how many commodities you make. It's not how big your economy is or how fast your economy is. The real fuel of capitalism is knowledge. And the Europeans and the US have a system of feeding knowledge into capitalism that I don't think the Chinese quite have at this point. So if we say that political power is connected to economic power, and that economic power comes from, let's say, from capitalist enterprise at this point in history anyway, then I think it's a poor bet to suggest that U.S. hegemony is on the downswing, because it's still at the center of capitalism. It's still at the center of knowledge production within capitalism. So if capitalism still exists as centered in Europe and the United States for, let's say, another 50, let's say another 100, and maybe another 150 years, then I don't see U.S. hegemony decreasing as a result.
So what you're saying here reminds me of a couple of Naeem-isms that I've remembered over the years. One of them is, only fools try to predict the future.
There it is.
There's another Naeem-ism I'll share with you. Well, I don't need to share it with you. You said it. I'll share it with the audience. Nothing imposed from the outside can ever be legitimate.
Yeah.
What's your teaching style? I want to talk about your book, Pedagogy as Encounter, kind of a memoir.
Yes, it is autobiographical. Yes.
Thankfully was a thin volume.
You forgot to say without jargon.
Yes, without lots of theoretical jargon, but that underpins the way you explain your method, your teaching method, which has a lot to do with this discussion we've been having. But before we get to your memoir, Naeem, and my time in your classroom, I want to say that I hope this conversation helps explain why the United States, its leadership, public intellectuals like Anne Applebaum and Francis Fukuyama, view the war in Ukraine as one of cosmic importance. What do you think?
It is, of course, of cosmic importance to the Ukrainians, no
Naturally.
doubt.
Oh, yes.
But
for global democracy, instead of fighting international communism or international terrorism, we're now in a global war against autocracy.
Yeah, I think when you have severe doubts about I'm talking about the United States here, if the United States has, as I claim, severe doubts about its own legitimacy in the world, then every conflict becomes a potential stake in the heart of that doubt, right? That if you don't really believe that your culture is the best and that your political system is the true gift given by God and human beings to the rest of the world, that you have some doubts about that, then it's easy for you to think that every skirmish, every war, everything that's out there in the world can have potential effects on your own country, on your own integrity, on your own legitimacy. Yeah. And
it's why it's impossible to get out of these engagements once they begin, because once you're in, you cannot then, eventually you're forced to get out, right? The inevitable happens. Yeah. But if you've built this up into such an important thing, and then you start, once the first drop of blood is spilled, and the United States obviously doesn't have ground troops in Ukraine, although the CIA is there. You can't give up. You've been telling us all along that we have to fight this war. Now, after it gets rough, after a couple of months, you're going to say, all right, time to leave. So you do that after 8 years or 20 years in Afghanistan.
Exactly. I mean, didn't we just see this movie first in Iraq and then in Afghanistan? And now we're going to see this film again? How many Rambo films can we see before they become the same one?
Well, I think that's why they're appealing, because you know what you're getting when you go into that movie theater.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I got to say, I am disturbed when I see headlines, read news stories about U.S. officials, NATO officials, whoever, saying we're going to defend the Ukrainians or help the Ukrainians for as long as it takes. What does that mean?
Didn't they say the same thing about Iraq and Afghanistan?
And I understand why the Ukrainians would maybe want to fight Russians for as long as it takes to get them out of their country, for goodness sakes.
Yes.
But, yeah. So Naeem Inayatullah decides to choose as his vocation teaching, even though he doesn't like speaking in public. And even though he believes, or he comes to believe, that teaching and learning aren't really possible the way we think about those two things. This is the underpinning of your memoir, Pedagogy as Encounter.
Let's say that there are three types of learning. Learning one is you learn the facts, right? Moon is composed of these kinds of materials. The solar system has got these many planets. A flower has this kind of characteristics. Those are facts. Okay, so that's learning one. Then you begin to learn. In learning two are patterns, the deeper causes of why these things are the way that they are. Learning three is what I'm talking about, which is learning three is learning about the assumptions on which you built your life, but you don't see right away. So it's easy to do learning 1. It's a little bit more difficult to do learning 2, the diagnosis and causes of things. But it's really almost impossible to do learning 3, which is we are each born into a crib, into a family, into a culture. And that crib and that family and that culture imparts upon us a metaphysics, an epistemology, an ontology, a way of knowing and what things count as important to know that we're not aware of. If in college, let's say, or even outside of college, one begins to question those foundational principles, what happens? Well, you lose your friends. You lose your family members. You lose the affection of your nation. Yeah, people start to stay away from you. Family members start to reject you. Your nation starts to call you by all kinds of names. Yeah, so if we think of this as a cost-benefit analysis, the student is on the one hand being challenged by a professor to come to knowledge about the very foundations of their own lives. And there's a benefit to that, which is you learn something that you didn't know before. But the cost is that you lose everybody. So my claim after looking at this kind of thing, and learning 3 especially, my claim is, look, from the beginning, I knew teaching was not really possible. None of my students actually learned the things that I was trying to teach them. They learned something, God knows what. But they didn't learn the very things that I was trying to get them to see, the global political economy being the thing I was trying to get them to look at. So it didn't take long for me to understand, only 4 or 5 years into my career, that not only were students not learning what I was teaching, it's very possible that they couldn't learn those things. Yeah. So I had this idea that the central assumption between a teacher and a student is, I'm going to teach you something and you're going to learn something. Well, suppose I turn both of those upside down. Teaching is not possible and learning is unlikely. Yeah, that's what I say in my book. Teaching is not possible, learning is unlikely. What happens if we start with those assumptions? What happens to the classroom space? What happens to the cultural space if we start with those assumptions instead?
And the way this works is, instead of you standing up at a lectern, lecturing for 45 minutes and then saying, okay, final 10 minutes, question and answers, you turn the classroom into a space where there can be encounters. So here I am, I'm 20 years old, and I sign up for your class. You were a new professor at Ithaca College, and I just assume you're going to be like all of my other history or politics professors. You're going to lecture. I always enjoyed your class, but I was frustrated with you. I got angry at you a couple of times. In your memoir, you give a lot of vignettes where some of your students are furious with you, or they just simply can't understand you.
Yes.
They're paying customers. They're coming to the classroom. They ask you questions and you don't answer them.
Yes. Yes. So the way that my classroom is structured, rules of the game, structure is the rules of the game is I give an assignment that the students agree to do. They read, and then we come to class. And after taking care of a few logistics in the first 5 minutes, the floor is open to anybody and to everybody. We see what emerges. And many students don't recognize that. They don't want to learn from their classmates. Yeah, they don't want to listen to their classmates.
Yeah, I agree. I don't give a shit what they have to say about anything. Go ahead.
You want to hear the authority in the room, that's me with the PhD and everything, tell them what there is to know. So when I don't do that, when all I do is ask questions, when all I do is let students speak and, as you said, interrogate them, then they can't recognize as something that they've experienced before in the classroom as being valuable. So then they come to my office and they say, when are you going to start teaching? And many of them in the past have gotten incredibly angry with me about why I'm not teaching from their point of view, at least that I'm not teaching. And when I explain to them what I am trying to do, they can't hear that. And so they do end up sometimes yelling at me.
Hopefully never beating your head in. No, that never happened, but...
That has, knock on wood, has not happened.
But you were afraid a couple of times. I don't mean to joke about this, but I was stunned as I read your memoir. Again, I haven't really seen you very often since I was in your class, just a few times. So some of these stories were surprising to me. There's one student who got so angry, you were actually concerned he might strike you.
A couple of times I felt that way. So, the funny thing is that to really make somebody angry, you don't necessarily have to poke them or insult them or make fun of them. All you have to do is make visible to them an assumption about their lives that they had never considered. Yeah. If you do that, one of the drawbacks of engaging in a process where a student comes to visualize a assumption that they built their lives around, but that isn't necessarily true, is that they get extremely angry.
You know, I remember this because I went through this same metamorphosis in a sense because, I was gung-ho patriotic, even though I would say, yes, I know that my country's done all these terrible things, but still, And it took some time, but I came to see what you were doing. And I feel like I learned, if I can use that term, more things from you, especially over the years as we've continued our friendship. And more things in that class that have stuck with me to this day, some 26 years later. I remember the books, and I remember the conversations, and I remember, the Naeemisms.
See, that's actually, I want to turn this around a little bit. That's a tribute to your own willingness to learn. When I meet a student for the first time, my automatic assumption is that they bring with them, A, a curiosity, and B, a curiosity that is honed towards a particular project. They may not even know that they're intensely curious. The student may not even know that they have a project in mind. My job is try to get that project to unfold itself, to let that curiosity be unbounded. Yeah.
You slyly plant the seeds.
More so, I even that metaphor, it doesn't really appeal to me because it's not that I'm planting the seeds. The seeds are already there. I'm not even watering the seeds. The watering is already there. The only thing that I'm doing in my interrogations is suggesting to the student that they're their own worst enemy when it comes to letting their curiosity expand. Yeah. Once I get them to see that they're blocking their own curiosity, the rest is really up to them. So that is the purpose of my kind of Socratic interrogation.
And you complement your method with really insightful books. And you choose books that have a way of, I think for a lot of students who are Americans, right, who go to your class, right? I mean, if you were teaching in Germany, you'd be dealing with German students or Australia.
Yep.
They come to class with certain notions about the goodness of their country.
Yes.
But you don't just fire a broadside at the greatness of the USA. You show how, we've been discussing this, the patterns. You showed us how Cortez dealt with the Aztecs.
Yes.
And that was a way of holding up a mirror to how the United States has dealt with, Iraq, post-1991.
Yes. I think that the metaphor that we might use here is that indirection is the best direction. Yeah. Subtlety, indirection, saying less. Yeah. People come to their own conclusions, then that's better than my lecturing them. They don't listen to me in any case. If I give a lecture and I tell you something, you'll forget it within days or weeks or months. But if you slowly come to that through your own work and your own realization, then it means something to you.
I did ask you questions, not just in our class, but since. And I was very frustrated at the scarcity of answers. But you were answering them. You were answering them by trying to show me how I could find this out on my own, in a sense.
It is.
Not to say it in a cliched way. This method had a cost for you. We already talked about how some of your students get really angry at you, and you're a really patient guy, but everyone has a breaking point. You can only take so much abuse. Some rich kid from who knows where going to Ithaca College, $40,000 a year tuition or whatever the hell it is now, come into your office and saying, why the hell aren't you doing your job?
Yeah.
In class, you would just simply not respond. And that's something else you taught me, that not every criticism requires an immediate response.
Yeah. Sometimes if I'm asked a pointed question, or if a student is making a criticism, or a colleague at a conference is making a criticism, I want to listen and let there be silence as a way of indicating to the person I'm having a conversation with that, listen, I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about what you just said. Let me think about it. And I don't have to have an immediate response. Maybe I'll come back next class session. I might have something, or I might not.
Or also if the person is making this criticism not in good faith.
Exactly. So there's two possibilities here. When I met you for the first time, you had spear-like energy that you were throwing out. And so my question, when you asked me pointed questions in class, I wasn't thinking, how am I going to answer Martin? I was thinking, what's the cause of this tremendous energy that he's throwing at me. How can I use that energy in a different way? What do I need to do in this moment to get this student to see that this energy isn't the best use? How can I redirect this energy?
That's right. And at times you had to limit the number of comments I was allowed to make. Well, that's why your class is so great. I could just call out. I could monopolize the discussion. Of course, I didn't know anything, right? I was 19, 20 years old. I didn't know shit. But it was fun to be in your class.
Yeah.
You can get away with a lot in Naeem's class.
You can say basically whatever you wanted. But here's the second part of this. Another reason to be silent after a criticism or a question is that you can wait for another person's voice to respond. So if you ask me a question about the greatness of the United States and I don't respond, it allows a student in the room to answer you. The student listening to your critique of me is noticing that I'm not saying anything, and that urges that student to respond. That person raises their hand. All of a sudden, we have a conversation between students. Yeah. Same thing happens in conferences. If I get a sharply pointed question at me and I don't respond, somebody in the audience is going to respond for me, and that has the advantage of now all of a sudden more than two people are involved in this engagement.
I think anyone who sat in a classroom would enjoy your book, Pedagogy as Encounter, especially other teachers, right? Because you rubbed other teachers without trying. You rubbed them the wrong way. They didn't appreciate your method, or you thought other teachers thought that somehow the way you were doing things was undermining their own authority in their classrooms.
Yeah, this was my experience. Yes, that I was too permissive. Yeah, part of the perception of other colleagues was I needed to correct my students' racism, that I needed to correct their sexism, that I needed to correct their cultural superiority, that when I saw those things happen and students said those kinds of things, that I needed to stop them and correct them, that my job as a teacher was to expose those things. And they saw their own jobs as that. Now, when I didn't do that, and they often thought of me as being wildly permissive.
Well, especially nowadays where college classrooms somehow to become a safe space. The issue of safetyism. I saw that word the other day in an article. Safetyism is...
Oh, what I like to say is that my classroom is a safe space in the sense that you get to say anything that you want, just about. There are even limits even for me. But it's not a safe space because now you have to defend yourself within that same public space against your students, against other students. Yeah. That I won't participate in defending a claim that you yourself have made, right? So it works both ways. You can say anything you want, but you also have to defend everything that you say.
That's encounter. That's how you learn.
That's what I call it.
Yes, that's an encounter. You don't learn by sticking your fingers in your ears and saying, I can't hear you, you're mean. That's me knocking the younger generation.
Yeah.
You know, but there were kids who were sensitive in our class. You know, well, I was sensitive too. I just didn't want to admit it.
Indeed,
we all have our own doubts and insecurities.
Yes, some people were sensitive and they expressed that as a quietness. You were sensitive and you expressed that as a loudness.
Yes. You know, I've taken on a new tack doing this podcast. I tend to just ask a question and listen.
Yeah.
And my guests, being professors, are more than happy to then talk.
Yeah. Actually, I see the development of your podcast as the natural outgrowth of your internal curiosity that I saw even when you were a young student in my class. And so one of the things that's come out to be true is that your internal natural curiosity has unfolded itself into this podcast series, right? Where you get to speak with world authorities on very particular subjects. So you've actually turned the podcast into your own classroom.
I have. And actually, some days I need a break because, I know my own limitations. It's a lot. I do feel like I'm going back to school. But one of your criticisms of this podcast, and yes, you do exist to criticize this project. I want that from you. You said that some of my interviews, most of them, lack tension. And I think that's true.
Yeah, I don't envy your position because here you are interviewing people with many degrees and lots of books and worldwide reputations, and they don't know you from Adam, and so they like to go on, and you need to interrupt. And from my point of view, you need to interrupt them once in a while and create difficulties for them, which you do. I think you do your best to interrupt them and also ask them really difficult questions. But it's tough for you because you can ask yourself, you can say to yourself, who am I to interrupt this world authority, right?
Yes. And in journalism today, there is this idea that journalists are not supposed to let people say things that they know to be untrue or ridiculous. Not that happens very often on my podcast, but I do find myself sharply disagreeing with people sometimes. But I am hesitant to, interrupt. And I guess also, when I was out covering the news every day, I didn't think twice about being obnoxious, sticking a mic in a politician's face and launching into a question, because that was my job. Here I'm trying to introduce the audience to a subject they may find interesting, that they could find useful as they consider what's going on in the world. So I'm interviewing somebody on my podcast, and I guess I feel I need to be polite. Maybe I'm too polite.
No, I mean, the trick to life is, how do you intervene in these encounters without making the person defensive, right? I mean, that's true for any conversation. We're sitting around the dinner table, for example, and you disagree strongly with somebody's position, but you're my guest. So how do I engage you in a way that produces the question, that increases the tension, but without causing offense? I mean, that takes a lifetime to learn.
Yes, it's a skill. Listening or not responding is one way, right?
Yeah.
But, you're at the Thanksgiving table, and Donald Trump has just won the election, and your Uncle Harry is talking about how he's so great and all this stuff. And, you want to scream at Uncle Harry or whatever. You know what I mean? How do you deal with that type of thing? You make a rule going in. No politics at the table.
Well, I mean, it doesn't even have to be big politics. I'll give you an example of a Thanksgiving dinner that we had many years ago. We were sitting around, 15, 20 people, and the conversation was good. We all enjoyed each other's company. And one of the claims that came up was, we started talking aesthetics and then music. And one of the claims I made was that I don't listen to music that has lyrics. And the person sitting next to me was a professor from the University of Florida, and he just had never heard such a claim and got really volatile and excited. And the only thing he kept saying was, this is outrageous. This is an outrageous claim to make. And I kept thinking to myself, make an argument.
Something about what you said picked at an insecurity he had, and it was difficult for him to verbalize that, to articulate how he was feeling.
That's right.
So he dodged. Instead, he put it on you to explain. How the hell can you like what you like?
Yeah. So I've had that argument over many different dinner tables, and now I'm slowly beginning to learn to make it in a way that gets into the public space between us, but doesn't necessarily cause them to just shut themselves off or shut me off.
Naeem Inayatullah, we thank you, my friend, for coming on and sharing your insights. Go to historyasithappens.com to sign up for my newsletter. Just enter your email in the box when you're prompted. And coming up on future episodes of History as It Happens, we're going to have Anatol Lieven and Ambassador William Taylor here to discuss what's next for the war in Ukraine. And we're going to look at the legacy of Phyllis Schlafly and the conservative movement, whose goal it was the overturning of Roe versus Wade. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.